Some secrets lie dormant for decades until fate decides to wake them with a bang. That's exactly what happened in a small town, forgotten by time in rural Colorado. There, where the wind carried more stories than dust, a widowed sheriff with a hard gaze and a silent heart saw his life turned upside down when a stranger was brought to his cell, accused of a crime no one could quite explain. She was unlike anyone who had ever set foot there. A defiant look in her eyes, a smile that showed someone who knew much more than she was letting on, and a presence that stirred something the old sheriff had been trying to forget for years. What he didn't expect was that upon releasing her, a gesture that not even he could explain, he would hear a phrase from her that would freeze the blood in his veins. "You trapped me when you left me, baby." The sheriff froze. His mind spun, searching for meaning, his chest tightening with a force he hadn't felt since the day he lost the woman he loved. That woman before him. Who was she? How could she know so much about a past he was trying to bury? And why did that sentence sound like a reunion he never imagined? What began as a routine arrest became the beginning of a journey of redemption, family secrets, and a truth that not even the dry desert could hide. Share this story to reach further, subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll be very happy to read each comment. This story isn't just about justice or crime. It's about broken bonds, forgotten loves, and the cruelty of time, which never leaves a debt unanswered. Come with me, because now begins chapter 1 of this story that will touch every corner of your heart. Sheriff Henry McBride wasn't just a symbol of authority in that dusty town. He was the weight of the past that everyone carried, even if they didn't want to. Widowed for nearly 20 years, he lived within the cold walls of the small office that served as a police station, surrounded by memories he refused to discard. On the wall, a yellowed portrait of his late wife Eleanor still smiled at him as it had the first day they met. It was a smile that haunted him on lonely nights, when the whiskey wore off and the wind blew memories through the open window. The town respected Henry, but few knew the weight he carried on his shoulders, a weight that was not just grief, but guilt. Years ago, when Eleanor became pregnant, happiness filled the small wooden house they called home. But fate, with its silent claws, stole everything one rainy night. Eleanor went into labor prematurely, and the town doctor was far away, trapped by a flood. The child was born, yes, but it didn't survive. Or at least that's what Henry was told, as he collapsed right there, kneeling beside the bed, drenched in sweat and tears. The sheriff was never the same again. He closed himself off from the world, buried what little hope he had, and vowed never to open his heart to anything or anyone again. What he didn't know was that the story didn't end there. Time passed, but Henry's heart didn't heal. Every child's cry he heard around town was a reminder of what he'd lost. He avoided parties, baptisms, anything that evoked family and children. He became the man who maintained order, but who had long ago lost the right to dream. Loneliness was his only faithful companion, and he grew accustomed to it, or at least he thought he had. Until that afternoon, when the guards brought the stranger to his cell, something in her gaze made the ground of the past tremble beneath his feet. There was something familiar, something he couldn't name, but it nagged at him like a pebble in his shoe. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the report, on the confusing accusation of cattle rustling. The woman said nothing, just watched him with a smile that wasn't of mockery, but of recognition. And it was when he opened the cell and said there wasn't enough evidence to keep her locked up that everything fell apart. She stood up, walked firmly toward him, stopped inches from his face, and, in a firm voice, said, "You trapped me when you left me, baby." The world stopped. The sheriff stood there, frozen, the paper slipping from his hand, because deep in his heart, something told him that she was telling the truth, and that maybe the past wasn't so buried after all. She swept into town like the wind before a storm, inconspicuous but impossible to ignore. She arrived astride a thin horse, her clothes dusty, and with a look no one could immediately decipher. The people of Rockwood were naturally suspicious, and whenever a stranger crossed the town line, rumors spread faster than dust itself. The stranger's brown eyes swept every corner of the main street, but when they landed on the small wooden police station, a different glow lit her face. Like someone finally finding the place they'd long sought. She dismounted gracefully and with a sure step, drawing curious glances and hushed whispers, until a man accused her of stealing cattle from neighboring lands. That was enough to bring old Henry McBride in to solve the problem. When the sheriff appeared, his heavy gait and his face hardened by time, the stranger's eyes made no secret. She knew him, or at least she knew who he was. But she maintained the mystery, letting the arrest happen without resistance, as if it were part of a plan known only to her. In the back of the cell, she leaned against the cold wall, crossed her arms, and watched the sheriff's every movement, every sigh, every sentence uttered in a voice slurred by the weariness of years. The people wanted swift justice, but Henry preferred to investigate before convicting someone who, to him, seemed entirely out of place in the story. There was something in her gaze, a silent call, an echo he couldn't ignore. The hours passed, and not even the curious onlookers' attempts to extract a confession from the prisoner were successful. She remained silent, but her smile, that persistent smile of someone who knows more than everyone else combined. That night, while Henry was reviewing papers, the silence was broken by a phrase from the cell. "How old do you think I am, Sheriff?" The question, uttered in the air, made him pause. "Old enough to get into trouble," he replied without looking. But the woman persisted. "Are you sure? Because I know exactly how old I am, and I know it's been that long since you left me." Henry looked up, his heart pounding for no apparent reason. "What the hell are you saying, young lady?" But she just smirked, letting the mystery hang like smoke in the air. There, in that simple cell, sat more than one prisoner. There was a story waiting to be told, a truth that not even the sheriff dared imagine. And Henry's heart, so accustomed to silence and order, began to beat a strange rhythm, as if finally the past were knocking on his door. The rumor that had spread through town was simple and cruel. The stranger had been seen near a neighboring property where cattle had mysteriously disappeared. For a small town like Rockwood, that was enough to make everyone point fingers and condemn without trial. When Henry tried to question the woman, she stared at him with that same enigmatic smile and simply said, "I didn't steal anything that wasn't already rightfully mine." The statement, delivered like a challenge, made the sheriff even more uneasy. He was familiar with cattle rustlings. He knew they were usually carried out by brutal men, nameless bandits. And this woman didn't fit any profile. It was as if she was there not by chance, but by choice. Still, duty prevailed. Henry investigated, searching for evidence, witnesses, any trace that would confirm the accusation. Nothing, just rumors and fear. The rancher who had accused her couldn't even accurately describe her face on the night of the alleged robbery. Everything seemed too fragile, as if the town itself wanted a scapegoat for its insecurities. And as much as the sheriff tried to remain impartial, something inside him pushed him in another direction. The desire to free her, to learn more, to not close the doors to this walking enigma. The woman sensed the conflict in his eyes and took advantage of it, teasing him with phrases that sounded more like puzzle pieces. One sultry night, Henry finally decided she would be released at dawn due to lack of evidence. When he went to open the cell, his heart was heavy, and it was at that moment that she spoke without blinking, the sentence that would tear Henry's world in two. "You trapped me when you left me, baby." The sheriff froze, the bunch of keys trembling in his hand, his breath catching in his chest. "What kind of joke is this?" he muttered. But the look in her eyes, oh, that wasn't the look of someone joking. It was the look of someone who'd been carrying a truth for years, waiting for the right moment to deliver it like a punch. A storm was brewing in Henry's head. He thought about the night of Eleanor's death, the difficult birth, the absent doctor. He thought about the body of the baby he'd never seen, the confused words of the neighbor he'd helped that night. Could it be? Could it be? Was it possible that the daughter he'd believed dead was there before him? The sheriff felt his legs weaken, the world spin, and he knew that from that moment on, there would be no escaping the past. The stranger wasn't a criminal. She was the ghost of a life he'd buried before he even knew her. The next morning, Sheriff McBride was no longer the same man everyone knew. The weight of the stranger's words the night before hammered at his head like a nail driven into his heart. The cell key felt heavier than ever in his calloused hands, but even without concrete proof, he could no longer keep her locked up. As he opened the rusted iron door, the metallic creak seemed to announce that time was about to take justice from his own past. The woman stood slowly, never taking her eyes off the sheriff, as if each step toward freedom were also a challenge to this man she knew so well without ever having actually met. Henry, for his part, was at a loss for words. Pride, fear, and guilt formed a lump in his throat. As she crossed the cell door, she stood facing him, so close that Henry could smell the subtle scent of earth and wind, something only those who know the world beyond the fences can experience. "Are you going to ask me what I meant, Sheriff?" she teased, her eyes sparkling like embers. Henry, suffocated by what he felt, could only shake his head. Then she took a step back, as if unwilling to hurt him further, and with a heavy sigh she said, "You never wanted to know what happened that night, did you? You never looked for answers. You just accepted what you were told and let time bury it all along with her, with me." The impact of her words was so strong that Henry felt his heart falter, as if his chest wanted to open a hole to hold all the guilt in the world. She didn't wait for an answer. She walked out of the police station, her firm steps marking the wooden floor, as if each step were a reminder that the past takes its toll. Henry remained there, motionless, his gaze lost between the walls that had heard so many prisoners' screams, but never witnessed the silence of a man defeated by his own history. He knew he needed to know more. He knew he couldn't let that woman leave without understanding what really happened the night he thought he'd lost everything. And it was then that for the first time in years, Henry felt fear. Fear of discovering that the biggest mistake of his life wasn't burying a daughter, but letting her be taken away without ever questioning. As he stepped out onto the street, Henry saw her mounting her horse, ready to leave. The sun was beating down, illuminating her face in a way that mixed strength and sadness. On an impulse he couldn't even understand, the sheriff shouted, "Wait!" She turned slowly, a slight smile at the corner of her mouth, as if she'd already known he would call her. "Tell me your name," Henry asked, her voice hoarse, almost a whisper. "My name?" she repeated, lifting her chin. "My name is Clara McBride. Or at least that's what an old man told me the day before he died." And then she was gone, leaving behind a broken man, an entire town steeped in rumors, and a heart that was finally beginning to wake up. That night was the longest of Henry McBride's life. He didn't sleep. He sat in his wooden chair, staring at the bottle of whiskey that this time he didn't touch. In his mind, the name she had said, Clara McBride, echoed like a lament, a scream muffled by years of denial and loneliness. It was a name he'd never dared think, a name never spoken because, officially, the baby had been stillborn. But what if it had all been a lie? The memories of that rainy night came rushing back. The rush, Eleanor's desperation as she screamed in labor, the neighbor who promised to get help, the time that seemed to stand still, and then the silence. The baby's cry he swore he heard, but which was soon drowned out by words of death. He never saw the body. He just believed what he was told. Desperate for answers, Henry rummaged through old archives, searching for any record of that night. But the town, so small and full of secrets, seemed to have erased every trace. It was then that he remembered Martha, an elderly woman who had been a midwife for years and who might know something. Even before sunrise, Henry went to her house, knocking loudly on the door, his heart racing. When Martha saw him, she recognized him immediately. "I knew you would come someday," she said, her voice weary but lucid. They sat together, and there, the past finally began to unearth itself. Martha said that she was called in a hurry that night, but when she arrived, Eleanor was already too weak. The baby had been born, yes, but not dead, fragile but alive. The problem was that along with Martha, the neighbor, a man known for shady dealings, decided that Henry, broken by grief, didn't need another burden. So without consulting anyone, he took the baby away, claiming he would die anyway. Martha never forgave that act, but she also never had the courage to face the sheriff with the truth. "I saw the child, Henry. It was a girl. It had Eleanor's eyes, and yours," she said, holding the old sheriff's hands, who was now crying shamelessly. Henry's world fell apart. The daughter he thought he'd lost was alive. And not only that, she'd been there for hours before him, with a look that held the entire story he'd been denied. Clara. The name echoed like a soul's lament. He knew he needed to find her again, needed to hear the whole truth from her, needed, more than anything, to ask for forgiveness. Because no amount of time in the world can erase a father's abandonment, even if he didn't know he was abandoning her. The day dawned slowly in Rockwood, as if even time itself was exhausted by the weight of the secrets that had emerged that night. Henry McBride, the old sheriff everyone saw as a man of iron, now carried a deep, dark hole in his chest, dug by guilt, remorse, and the despair of not knowing where Clara had gone. The town woke up knowing what had happened. Rumors were spreading like wildfire, and every resident had a theory about the stranger's true identity. But Henry didn't want to hear the rumors. He wanted only one thing: to find her. And for the first time in many years, he didn't wear the sheriff's star simply out of duty. He wore it like a man who needed to atone for the greatest mistake of his life. Mounted on his horse, Henry set off south, following scattered reports that she had taken the old path to Dry Valley. Every footprint, every sign on the trail was a ray of hope that it wasn't too late. As he rode, he remembered his days with Eleanor, how she dreamed of her daughter growing up strong and courageous. And now, knowing that Clara was alive and well, a grown woman, covered in scars, was a relief mixed with despair. Why had fate been so cruel? Why hadn't he had the strength to seek the truth sooner? Every jolt of the horse was a punishment, a reminder that lost time cannot be recovered. On the second day of their journey, he found her. Clara was standing before a stream, her horse grazing nearby, her face turned to the open sky as if conversing with the stars even under the midday sun. Henry stopped at a safe distance, his heart beating faster than in any gunfight he'd ever faced. She sensed his presence even before he called out. She turned slowly, her gaze steady, unsurprised. "I knew you'd come," she said simply, as if fulfilling a prophecy. Henry dismounted slowly, each movement heavy, as if the ground were made of lead. When he tried to speak, his voice failed. Pride, guilt, and pent-up love formed a knot he couldn't untie. Clara watched him patiently, as if knowing the weight an old heart carries, until he finally did. His voice was hoarse, almost a lament. "Forgive me. I didn't know. God knows I didn't know." Tears ran shamelessly down the lines marked by time and sadness. Clara approached slowly, her eyes watering but without rancor. When she was close enough, she touched the sheriff's face with her fingertips, soft as a breath. "I didn't come to blame you, Father. I came to find you, because even from afar, something inside me knew you were here, waiting for me." The ground seemed to disappear beneath Henry's feet. Father. She called him Father. And in that moment, the man who wore an iron badge finally allowed himself to be just a man reunited with the daughter fate had tried to steal from him. They stood there before the stream, unhurried, simply breathing in the moment that seemed longer than time itself. Henry didn't know how to make up for the decades of absence, but he knew he had to try. "Tell me everything," he asked, and Clara, her voice breaking, began to tell her story. She said she was raised by a rude man who never revealed who her real parents were. She said she grew up hearing that she had been rejected, that no one had wanted her. But inside her, There was always a void, a name she couldn't pronounce but which pulsed like a permanent absence. When the old man who raised her was dying, he revealed the truth, that she had been taken from a home during a difficult birth because they believed the father couldn't bear to raise a daughter alone, and that lit in her the flame of finding her roots. Clara wandered through barren lands, crossed cities, faced dangers, but never gave up. She knew that somewhere the man who gave her life still existed, and now, finally before him, she saw a man broken, yes, but still full of love, hidden in silence. Henry heard everything, each word like a sharp knife cutting through skin hardened by time. And when she finished, he held her hands tightly as if holding the whole world. "I was a coward, Clara. I should have questioned, sensed that you were still alive. Forgive me for being so blind." Clara smiled, a smile that mixed pain and relief. "You didn't lose me, Father. I was always coming to find you. It just took a little longer than it should have." They returned to Rockwood together, riding side by side, the silence between them now comfortable, full of promise of a future yet to be written. The town, upon seeing them arrive, was at a loss for words. The sheriff everyone knew was different, not in his appearance but in his eyes. Henry McBride finally had a reason to move forward, not just as sheriff, but as a father. And Clara's presence, as strong as the mother he'd lost, was living proof that life, no matter how cruel, always offers a second chance. The old sheriff knew he couldn't change the past, but he could, yes, write a new chapter. And that was more than he'd ever dared dream. The days passed, and for the first time in decades, the Rockwood police station was no longer a tomb of silence and dead memories. Clara walked through town with a firm step, her gaze always haughty, and a discreet smile that carried more power than any weapon. She rebuilt the bond with her father, not through haste or demands, but through presence. Every morning she brought the sheriff coffee, sat beside him without needing to say a word. And that, for Henry, was a gift no amount of gold in the world could buy. He now allowed himself to look at Eleanor's portrait on the wall with a new feeling, not just longing, but gratitude. After all, a piece of her still lived before him, in Clara's features, in the strength of her voice, in the firm way she faced life without fear. The old sheriff understood belatedly that time can take a long time, but blood, love, truth, time cannot erase these. Henry McBride learned to live again. With Clara by his side, he rediscovered the meaning of small gestures, taking care of the house, tending the garden that had been dry and neglected, repairing the fence he had long ago let fall down. Each repair to the wood was like a repair to his own heart. And even the residents of Rockwood began to see him differently. The old sheriff, once tough and untouchable, now smiled occasionally. Occasionally, a laugh could be heard coming from the porch of his house. And that was almost a miracle to those who knew him. Clara didn't need a daily apology. She knew that the greatest request for forgiveness was this aging man trying to be better, trying to deserve every minute with her. On quiet nights, sitting on the porch, Henry would gaze at the stars and tell stories about Eleanor, about how she dreamed of having a daughter, about how happy she would have been to see that strong, courageous woman before them. Clara listened to everything with shining eyes, absorbing each memory as if reconstructing her own past. "I'm no longer the girl I was," she would say, "but here, with you, I feel like I can be who I should have been." And Henry, his heart heavy with emotion, simply held her hand, feeling that finally he was no longer alone. Time had taken so much away, but it had also given him back the chance to love. They knew the past could not be changed, but they also knew the present could be rewritten every day. Clara was no longer the outsider. She was a daughter. She was a bond. It was life telling Henry McBride that there is always time to wake from grief, to rebuild homes and affections, to look in the mirror and see not the tired old man, but the father who had finally found his lost girl. And at every sunset, when the city slept and the sky burned red and gold, Henry looked at Clara and thought, "I thought I'd lost you, but in truth, it was you who found me." And this story, my friend, is not just about a sheriff, an outsider, or a secret from the past. It's about me, about you, about all of us who once thought time had stolen everything from us, who once believed there was no going back, that it was too late to apologize, to start over, to find what was once taken from us. But life is stubborn. It surprises us when we least expect it and shows us that love, connection, belonging, they can be closer than we imagine. Perhaps, like Henry McBride, you too are there, locked in a world of guilt and silence. But I tell you, there's always time to open the door. There's always time to hear the phrase that changes everything. You trapped me when you left me, baby. If this story touched your heart, I urge you, share it with someone who might need a reunion, a push to believe again that the past can be reconciled. Subscribe to the channel to hear more stories like this, ones that warm our hearts and remind us of what truly matters. Leave a comment where you're listening from. I'll read each one with care. Share this video on WhatsApp, on social media, with someone you know carries a void that only a reunion can fill. And don't leave yet. Keep watching the channel's videos, because each story told here is a bridge for those who are lost, a hug for those who feel like they have no other way. Thank you so much for sticking around until the end. May this story live on in you as a reminder. Sometimes the bonds that unite us are stronger than time. Until the next video,